Right, where were we? Oh yeah, gnomes. Definitely gnomes. If you are the sort of person who enjoys a good practical joke, and also happens to be the sort of person who plays Dungeons and Dragons and other similar role-playing games, you may well ask yourself if there isn't some way to combine your two interests into some sort of interesting RPG character. And as anyone who has played more than 5 minutes of D&D can tell you, there most certainly is. What you want to do is play a gnome, though many people would rather you didn't. The reason they would rather you didn't is because many people who do choose to play gnomes only understand the character of the gnome in the same way they understand social media's idea of practical jokes. If someone hasn't been publicly humiliated, shamed, or even slightly maimed, it just isn't a very good practical joke, is it? You haven't really had a good go at practical joking someone if you don't come out the other end feeling at least a little bit superior to your victim, perhaps because of your latent personality issues derived from your difficult relationship with your father. At least that's what I always assume their problem is. And you watching it, you get at least some of that superior feeling just by observing and quote-unquote enjoying the joke. These are the sorts of people who look at a gnome in D&D and think to themselves, what a jolly good time I'll have. Not anyone else, just them. They read about as far into the description of the gnome as the first occurrence of the word trickster, stop and close the book, believing they have grasped the heart and soul of this race of ancient, diminutive people with a long and challenging history. And so they think no more about it. Of course, what they really want is license to play tricks on party members and get away with it by pointing to the rulebook and saying, look, it says so right there. I practically have to steal your money and gems and spend them on myself because gnomes are tricksters who love a good joke. You can't argue with the rules. I'm just playing my character. When really it's just an excuse for them to continue to be the jerks they've always been. This time with a license. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to run your game. There are plenty of other shows for you to listen to that do that. And as always, you can run it any wrong way you want. I will, however, say that such a character surviving more than a couple of sessions would be a great and enduring surprise to me. First time the barbarian's favorite sword goes missing should be enough to suggest a natural solution to the group for the gnome problem, once he finds out where it is. Even if all the large, heavy rocks falling out of the clear blue sky don't get the gnome first. The reason every GM other than myself who looks at a player-presented gnome character sheet groans, rolls their eyes, and acts as if everyone has just caught the plague is because they are so often the ruin of the entire party just by showing up. And if there is one thing GMs hate more than seeing a gnome show up in the party, it's seeing the word rogue in near company to it. A trickster armed with the tools to ply its trade is nobody's friend and is just asking for a highly specific whoopsie terminal pregame beheading, which is why I only ever run gnome paladins. But what I will tell you is that almost everything you think you know about gnomes, how they act, what they look like, where they come from, what they enjoy doing, is all a bit off the mark. Gnomes aren't just pranksters hiding in the bushes waiting to swipe your dice, dump a heavily cursed item into your bag, and spend all the party gold in town on whoopee cushions. They've got a history as rich and complex as any epic quest. You just have to look beyond nearly everything you've ever read about them in RPGs to find out what's really going on with gnomes. If you don't think this has anything to do with our magic series, well, won't that be a splendid trick when I've pulled it off? This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddleback. So, what does Dungeons & Dragons want us to know about gnomes? Let's ask it, or rather, let's quote a bit from a few recent editions. In AD&D, gnomes were kin to dwarves. Well, sure, in the sense that all folks who are short and live underground are probably kin to some sort of dwarf, though the description does go on to note that gnomes are noticeably smaller than their distant cousins. Now, there's a question to be asked here about family relations and distance and who did what to whom, but we aren't going to ask it because we already know how much trouble the word half generates in D&D conversations these days. And besides, we already know the answer. So, moving on. Gnomes, as they proudly maintain, are also less rotund than dwarves, which seems a bit harsh being that most dwarves are known not to be fat, but rather compact powerhouses of muscly damage. It's all the mining and swinging of axes and hauling rocks around and smithing, you see. A fat dwarf is not a dwarf with a steady job. We're looking at you, Bomber. Fewer s'mores, more ores. Gnome noses are noted as being much larger than dwarf noses, probably so it can be stuck in where it doesn't belong more easily. Their skin is dark tan or brown, they're universally saddled with white hair, and they live for about 350 years. Then comes the part we've been waiting for. Gary proudly declares that gnomes in AD&D have a lively and sly sense of humor, especially for practical jokes. And as we've already pointed out, most folks stop reading right there. So we miss all the bits about a love of finely wrought items, gem cutting skills, jewelry making, and living in rocky, rolling hills and wooded areas. Although the words sly and furtive might pop out at you further down the paragraph, the word reservedly will go entirely unnoticed. They fare little better in D&D 3rd edition and 3.5, which just seems to recast them wholesale. Gnomes are welcome everywhere as technicians, alchemists, and inventors. Despite the demand for their skills, most gnomes prefer to remain among their own kind, living in comfortable burrows beneath rolling wooded hills where animals abound. Now, I don't know how comfortable your burrow is going to be with an alchemist living in it, but there you go. Instead of working with gems and jewelry, it's things that go poof and smell, and things that go spraying and slice when you least expect it. When it comes to their personality, according to 3.5, gnomes adore animals, beautiful gems, and jokes of all kinds. Members of this race have a great sense of humor, and while they love puns, jokes, and games, they relish tricks. The more intricate, the better. They apply the same dedication to more practical arts, such as engineering, as they do to their pranks. Gnomes are inquisitive. They love to find things out by personal experience. At times, they're even reckless. Their curiosity makes them skilled engineers, since they are always trying new ways to build things. Sometimes a gnome pulls a prank just to see how the people involved will react. And there's where the jokesters stop reading. For them, nothing exists beyond this point in the description. Even the bits about being good aligned, I'm playing an exception, and tending towards lawful or chaotic. Especially ignored is the note about gnome tricksters being more playful than vicious. Now, D&D 5.0 tried things a different way, granted. First, the description of the gnome opens with a bit of fiction, whose main takeaways seem to be that gnomes don't fit in with the bigger races well, and have lots of gnome-sized equipment to apply their gnome-sized trades. And also, that cats are indifferent to them. But then cats are indifferent to most things, so this isn't really the help it might have been. All of the usual points about height, hair, skin color, and so forth apply. Except now, 5.0 tries to tell you how to play them properly, with remarks about vibrancy, delighting in life, and plastering a big, shiny smile on your face. They include embroidered clothing and neat beards, and then the line everyone has been waiting for. Though gnomes love jokes of all kinds, particularly puns and pranks, they're just as dedicated to the more serious tasks they undertake. No one has ever made it to the second half of that sentence. Curiously, most of the rest of the description after that point is cribbed almost directly from D&D 3.5, claiming gnomes end up mostly as inventors and tutors to humans. Now, you might well wonder what it was Gygax was up to when he brought gnomes into AD&D when they hadn't been there before. Well, you can just keep wondering that, because all Gary has had to say about it is summed up in an answer he provided in an online forum about the origin of gnomes, which goes as follows. Gnomes in myth were created as one of the 4 elementals, that of earth. I took what I recalled from fairy tales and folklore about mine spirits to create a unique race for the D&D game. Yes, there were already halflings and dwarves, but I made the gnomes sufficiently different so as to allow another choice for character race. I have used it in a PC, he being a gnome illusionist thief. I have read all the Andrew Lang various color in the title books, save the Yellow Book of Fairy Tales, Anderson and Brothers Grimm fairy tales, as well as many a book on folklore and legend. And that's your lot. Gary wanted some additional races, halflings and dwarves being insufficiently short. He based a lot of their descriptions, such as it was, off the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm and related folklore. And he once played a gnome illusionist thief, meaning he was just as bad as everyone else who ever played a gnome. Which, for Gary, is fairly typical, if we're honest. But here's the thing. Gary was, I'm sure, entirely honest about his inspirations for the gnome. And after a while, I'll explain why we can be sure of that. However, some of his inspirations were a bit off. See, Andersen and the Brothers Grimm never really wrote about gnomes. Sure, there's a Grimm story called The Gnome, which is about 3 princesses stuck underground because they ate an apple from the wrong tree and so have to be rescued by the by now traditional youngest of 3 brothers with help from a diminutive man-shaped forest figure. But nowhere in the story itself is the word gnome used except in the translated title, which was originally called the Zwerg and is German for the dwarf, which has also unhelpfully been translated as the elf in some versions. But you can check out our elf episode for more about that. The story, whatever its title should be, gets closest when it calls the little helper an earth mannequin, or little man of the earth. More on that in a bit. There are other examples, of course, that could be called out as some form of gnome. A dozen variations on the story of the shoemaker and the, very small creatures of some description could be accused of being gnomes. And I certainly recall reading a children's story about a brownie that would work just as well as a gnome, but you can listen to our episode on familiar spirits and various other topics for all that. All of which is to say the elf, gnome, and dwarf nomenclature is all a bit shaky in terms of what applies to what, so don't rely on Gygax for that particular set of distinctions. Of course, there's another affront to proper gnomery to deal with, and a few of you may have an example of it out in your front yard or garden somewhere. That's right, the garden gnome. Now, I'm certain we've talked about Nissa before. Probably that elf episode again. As a refresher, Nissa are Scandinavian household spirits that perform various beneficial duties around house and farm as long as you treat them well. If you don't, they either leave forever, abandoning you and yours to your fate, or else curse you to a miserable life until appeased. What is important for us about the Nissa, at least in this episode, is that the Nissa are described as looking in both dress and appearance exactly as we depict garden gnomes. Bright colors, cone-shaped hat, big beard, etc. Garden gnomes, for all practical purposes, are really Nissa, which inspired helpful elves and not gnomes. Except in your garden, where the Nissa as garden gnome is meant to sit around protecting and benefiting your garden in some way. So to be clear, garden gnomes are not gnomes, they are Nissa. Unless your name was Philip Griebel and you lived in 19th century Germany, which, all things being equal, is not your particular circumstance. Griebel was a sculptor, and it was he who created the entire concept of garden gnomes in one fell swoop. Except Griebel and those folks around at that time who needed to decorate their gardens called them Gartenzwerg. And since we already know that Zwerg means dwarf, and you can work out Garten for yourself, you can see the problem. Originally, they were made of clay and painted in bright colors, but more recently they've been made of resin or brightly colored plastics molded into several typical shapes, everything from the dwarf laying down, to the dwarf in wheelbarrow, to the dwarf taking a nice day off fishing in a puddle that was never really going to hold any fish anyway. All of which are intended, more or less, when they are intended as anything other than decoration, to ensure a bountiful harvest by protecting the various vegetables, even the ones you don't like, and animals, which are so essential to successful gardening. Oh, and evil spirits. They were definitely meant to keep evil spirits away. How, you may ask? Well, during the Renaissance, certain relevant developments took place that suggested that gnomes weren't just extremely short people, but rather magical creatures with special powers capable of great wonders. And this is the period when much of the mythology and folklore of the gnome begins to develop. Practically every shoemaker in Germany suddenly had a band of helpful gnomes working out in the shop at night as an undocumented workforce paid in bowls of milk and bits of bread. Once those sorts of stories were out, it was only a matter of time before inanimate garden dwarves became garden gnomes that came to life at night and helped out around the place. Which, finally, brings us to the place we wanted to be from the start, explaining why you, Dungeons & Dragons, WotC, and everyone else except in a very small way Gary Gygax, are wrong about gnomes right from the get-go. And also to explain why we had to plunk an episode about gnomes down in the middle of our otherwise straightforward series about magic in D&D. Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who shall hereafter be referred to as Paracelsus because even though it was a very fun name to say, who has enough time left in life to type all that every time, was a Swiss physician, theologian, alchemist, and philosopher who lived during the German Renaissance, making him, of course, a real Renaissance man. And if you spotted the words alchemist, theologian, and philosopher in his description and went, aha, let me assure you, you are correct. He is the reason we had to talk about gnomes, and those are the reasons he crops up in our series about magic. Like many of the other names that have popped up on this show, and particularly in this series, Paracelsus had a lot to say about how he thought the world worked and the sorts of things you could do in it. He even had his own version of Hermes' earlier idea of as above, so below. Except for Paracelsus, it was all about the macrocosmic of the universe reflecting in the microcosmic of the human body. If the body was out of tune with the universe, then you were uncomfortable, ill, or even worse, dead. And all of this had to do with the mineral balance of the body in general. Which meant, for Paracelsus, if you could correct the body's chemical balance to be more in tune with the universe, you could cure whatever illness was making life difficult. Not much you could do about being dead, though. Still, he did work out that taking certain chemicals could cure certain diseases and therefore get some credit for treating diseases with actual medicine rather than just guessing about how much mouse blood and dog vomit would maybe make your earache stop. Of course, he gets considerably less credit because of two of his other beliefs. The first being that disease and illness was also caused by poison rays sent down to Earth by the stars. Although he did specify that not all poisons were bad, nor intended to be bad, but rather the amount of the poison one received was the real determiner of whether it was going to make you ill or not. Which, given how wrong the basis for the statement was, turns out to be more or less right. Consider chemotherapy. But keep in mind, with some poisons, the correct dosage is none. He also gets a bit less credit because of his belief in the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures works basically like this. If you come upon a plant that looks, either in part or in whole, in some respect a bit like an ear, then it could be safely assumed that it was good for treating ailments of the ear. Similarly, bits of plants that looked like eyes might be good for eye ailments, and plants that looked like entire human bodies were obviously good for treating the whole body. See mandrakes in Harry Potter. Basically, plants that look like other things were intended to treat illness in those other things. And here is where Paracelsus made his big mistake, because in his view, everything in the universe was interrelated, and because beneficial medical substances could be found in herbs, minerals, and various chemical combinations, Paracelsus viewed the universe as one coherent organism. An organism pervaded by a uniting, life-giving spirit, and that in its entirety, humans included, it was God. Which, as you might expect in the 1600s, upset the Catholic Church no end. And this, combined with his other beliefs about the universe, God, and the way things worked, soon led him to exploring the more esoteric arts, which we might choose to call magic. Now, we're glossing over an awful lot here. Paracelsus made some major contributions to both science and medicine, at least one of which you are guaranteed to have heard of. Opium. Paracelsus introduced opium to Western medicine along with all its uses, including the development of laudanum, famous spoiler of Renaissance dandies. He also did important work on the hip new disease of the day, syphilis, and worked out that it could only be contracted by contact and created the first complete description of the disease and its course. He's the father of the clinical diagnosis and widely given credit for creating the terms gas, alcohol, and chemistry. He developed the field of toxicology and began important early work in the area of psychosomatic diseases, illness that's only in your head. He also wrote a number of books on a variety of fields of interest that are still in use today, some more officially than others. Much like Faust, his books were soon gobbled up for the supposed hidden secrets they contained, especially those involving alchemy and early chemistry. Many of them were presumed to contain magical formula just waiting to be discovered. But the book we are particularly interested in here isn't really a book. It's more of a treatise, called A Book on Nymphs, Sylphs, Pygmies, and Salamanders, and Other Spirits. Paracelsus set out to explain the other forms of life, well known by those interested in folklore, but seldom seen or even acknowledged by those who were of more serious mind. Paracelsus opens with the following. Know, therefore, that the purpose of this book is to describe the 4 kinds of spirit men, namely the water people, the mountain people, the fire people, and the wind people. We consider them to be men, although not from Adam, but other creatures, apart from man and all other animals, in spite of the fact that they come among us and children are born from them, although not of their own kind, but of our kind. Paracelsus was convinced that there were other races of people alive on Earth who were just like humans in every respect that mattered. They bred like us, they lived like us, and died like us. They ate and drank and breathed like us, got sick like us, and moved about like us, except that, according to Paracelsus, they did it all in different mediums than us, and so, while they performed all the functions of human beings and could interbreed with us and produce hybrid offspring with us, they were fundamentally different than us because the medium they lived in influenced all the things they did. Although they are both spirit and man, yet they are neither one nor the other. They cannot be men since they are spirit-like in their behavior. They cannot be spirits since they eat and drink, have blood and flesh. Therefore, they are a creation of their own, outside the two, but of the kind of both, a mixture of both. Their customs and behavior are human, as is their way of talking, with all virtues better and coarser, more subtle and rougher. They know how to make use of things, have wisdom to govern, justice to preserve and protect, for although they are beasts, they have all the reason of man, except the soul. After explaining all the ways they are like us, except of course the lack of a soul the church would be interested in, Paracelsus goes on to finally name the creatures that are apparently all around us but largely unseen. The name of the water people is Undina, of the air people Silvestris, of the mountain people Gnomes, and of the fire people Vulcani. And this is what I meant when I said earlier that I was sure Gygax was honest, at least in part, about his inspiration for the gnome. They were originally elementals, and it was Paracelsus who first came up with the gnome and introduced it as such. The elemental people of Earth, the Gnomi. But everything after that, all the trickiness and practical jokes and all that, not a bit of it came from the original description of gnomes. Because the first description of gnomes is largely unplayable. As you hear the following, remember that the original meaning of the Greek word chaos was emptiness or void, and Paracelsus uses it here to mean something akin to a medium through which one can pass without being affected by it. To the Gnomi in the mountains, the earth is their air and is their chaos. For everything lives in chaos, that is, everything has its abode in chaos, walks and stands therein. The earth is air to the Gnomi, hence they do not suffocate. They do not require our air, we do not theirs. Now, the earth is not more than mere chaos to the mountain mannequins, for they walk through solid walls, through rocks and stones, like a spirit. This is why these things are all mere chaos to them, that is, nothing, as it is easy for us to walk through air, and air cannot stop us, so rocks and cliffs are easy to them. And the coarser the chaos, the more subtle is the creature, and the more subtle the chaos, the coarser the creature. The mountain people have a coarse chaos, therefore they must be more subtle. And man has a subtle chaos, therefore he is all the coarser. So we've established a bit about the gnomish environment. But how do they survive and go about their lives in this world of earth and mountain? Know that each chaos has its two spheres, the heaven and the soil, just as we men walk on earth. Earth and heaven give us our food, and the chaos is in between the two. Thus also with the Gnomi, whose soil is water, and whose chaos is terra, and the heaven is their sphera, that is, the earth stands in water. To them the earth is chaos, and the water the soil. Paracelsus goes on at length. Gnomes are about 2 spans tall. For those of you not currently measuring things in spans, a span is the distance from the tip of your thumb to the tip of your little finger. A variable distance to be sure, but one you always have to hand. If you've ever dug around in the ground and come across attics, vaults, and other structures that seem to exist without explanation, that's because that is where the gnomes have made their homes, all about a yard or meter high. They also make use of mountain caves and other naturally occurring structures. Paracelsus's gnomes are also known for their ability to keep and enforce pledges they've made. They are an honest, hard-working folk who are loyal to us humans and enjoy spending their money with us. What money, you may ask? Well, obviously, the money they wish up whenever they need it. They coin it themselves, and it appears just by needing to have it. Fortunately, it is always good money, and not like that phony fairy money you hear so much about from the leprechauns. So desirable is gnome money that they can use it to buy people off and pay them to go away and not bother them. Which they will need to do, because the gnome's chief occupation is guarding the treasures of the earth. All the precious metals and gems are guarded by groups of gnomes and protected from discovery until such time as they are actually needed. Only once a gnome has given up its guard duty will earthbound treasures be found. While they guard them, they forge them into more and more precious designs and reveal them to the world at large by and by to prevent them from being found all at once. The discovery is coordinated in such a way that no one place gets all the treasure at once, but rather the whole is spread across geography and time as seems best, and so that they will continue to be discovered from the beginning of time until the end. And that is pretty much everything Paracelsus had to say about gnomes when he created them. Save one further interesting fact. And given everything we've heard so far about what gnomes are and where they come from, both according to Paracelsus and the general run of folklore, you'll probably be very surprised to hear the answer to the question we mentioned back towards the start of this episode, the one we declined to answer when it came up. See, gnomes and dwarves aren't really distant cousins. Not at all. According to Paracelsus, dwarves are what you get when men and gnomes interbreed. And you won't get that into D&D. No, sir. Thank you for listening to this episode of GM Word of the Week. I hope you found it entertaining and informative. A quick note just to say thank you to everyone who expressed their support and encouragement off the back of the last episode. It's much appreciated. This episode is a Fiddleback production and was researched, written, and produced by Brian Casey. Find more episodes at gmwordoftheweek.com. You can help support the show at buymeacoffee.com/fiddleback with both one-time and ongoing pledges. Support keeps the commercials away. Music is provided by Blue Dot Sessions, home of minimalist acoustic music for production and pleasure. Visit them at sessions.blue. This really blew my mind. The fact that me, an overfed, long-haired, leaping gnome, should be the star of a Hollywood movie.